Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. The D.C. press corps allowed itself to be duped by one man on COVID-19. And so you immediately think
Dr. Fauci.
Tony Fauci. But that's not who Arthur Bloom is talking about. Arthur Bloom is the editor of the American Conservative Online. He joins us now. Arthur, thanks for being with us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, glad to be here.
The one man that you reference in your piece is not Tony Fauci, but it's a name that has started to circulate after some of those FOIAs requesting emails were presented and the communications between Fauci and others were provided. We learn about a gentleman named Peter Dack from EcoHealth Alliance.
That's right, and to be clear, he seems to have known Fauci quite well, and one of the two people who approved the money going to the Wuhan lab through EcoHealth, it had to be Fauci or one other person. So I think it's fair to assume that they've had a working relationship for some time. So this guy, Peter Dack, he's the head of the EcoHealth Alliance, which is an NGO that's worked on gain-of-function research for quite some time, mostly funded by the U.S. government, though we're now finding out that they were funded in part by Google's charitable arm. So, the joke that I make about this is if Peter Dack wasn't a real person, Alex Jones would invent him. He's got fingers in all these different pies. He's involved in manipulating the media. And the thing that happened last week, the big new development, was that he was removed from the Lancet Commission to investigate the World Health or the Wuhan lab, and that's the second commission that this guy was actually put on. The first one was the one by the World Health Organization itself. So he was put on that one. As far as I know, he's still on that one. Then he was also put on this Lancet Commission, which is operating under the authority of the United Nations, and he was just removed or fired himself from that one. So. This is a little bit like having, after the oil spill in the Gulf or something, putting the Exxon CEO on the commission to investigate how this oil spill happened.
Or Captain Hazelwood himself. Peter Dack, though, this is a guy who was in those emails, and he was the guy who emailed Tony Fauci early on, thanking him for dismissing the idea that the origin of the virus was the lab.
That's right. I think you can fairly say at this point, nobody is more responsible for the suppression of the lab leak theory than this guy. And he's a guy who's very, very conflicted. So right at the beginning, we now found out he was involved in organizing a letter in the Lancet by, I think the number is 27 scientists, saying that this is misinformation, the lab leak is misinformation. That letter he didn't actually sign. So you've got all of these prestigious scientists that say, dismiss the lab leak theory, and then he's clearly pushing back and is praising Anthony Fauci for pushing back and calling it misinformation as well. So those two data points are sufficient for Google and Facebook to begin suppressing and censoring anybody who really brings it up. And so that's pretty key. It's hard to overstate that. There are other ways he's involved too. In 2020, Trump clearly had more information than we did about some of this stuff, and he canceled the grant to the Wuhan lab through EcoHealth. And what's sort of most galling about that is that right after that happened, there emerged a couple of stories saying Trump is defunding COVID research. He's making it harder for us to get a cure. And NPR and 60 Minutes both did stories about how Trump is making it harder for us to get a cure. He's ending public funding to vaccines. Of course, that wasn't the case at all. Or maybe it's the case, but if this lab is implicated in the outbreak itself, clearly the obvious thing you have to do is shut it down. And so 60 Minutes and NPR both interviewed Dack to basically say this, to say that Trump is cutting funding to us. It's just the most incredible kind of lack of context and lack of the remotest skepticism for any guy in a white lab coat.
How did you get follow the trail of Dack? What
Well,
motivated you?
Nobody is more heavily quoted in news stories about COVID by the New York Times or by some of these prestige outlets than this guy. And I guess I've been looking into kind of the origins, finding every bit of information that I can, and it was pretty clear from the beginning that this guy was very deeply involved. And I guess one of the big things that kind of broke the seal on this was Steve Hilton's reporting in Fox. I think he was the first one to really throw it out there that the U.S. government has funded this research that's very likely implicated in the outbreak.
Well, just to provide more material for a Peter Schweitzer book on Peter Dack at some point, the story out, Rosemont Seneca Technology Partners, which is the investment firm founded by, it's an offshoot of Rosemont Capital, which is the investment fund founded by one Hunter Biden and John Kerry's stepson, was a lead financial backer of MetaBiota, which is a pandemic tracking and response firm that partnered with Peter Dajak's EcoHealth Alliance, as well as the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So now you have Hunter Biden's Chinese, Chi-Com-backed investment fund partnering with a company that is partnering with EcoHealth Alliance as well as the lab.
That's right. I saw that story last night, and I think the cooperation that story refers to is a group called Predict, which does sort of pandemic modeling and things like that. But yeah, that's true too. We still don't have a whole lot of details about what the substance of that cooperation was. But that's something that's out there. And I think the main takeaway from both of these things is that the public health establishment and the political establishment are very deeply implicated in all of this, and that's why they don't want you to talk about the lab leak theory.
Well, what was his cut? I mean, if the government was giving money to EcoHealth and then they passed some of that money on to the lab in Wuhan, do we know what Peter was making off of that?
Well, presumably just his salary from EcoHealth. I don't know off the top of my head what that salary was.
With respect to this larger conversation about the relationship between American public health agencies, NIH, NIAID, and as well as the government generally with communist China for the purposes of research, the argument is always going to be that we're partnering with, we're collaborating in the interests of trying to do better disease virus prediction, as well as developing therapeutics and developing vaccines. And they have some really good scientists, even though they're lorded over by communists. And so it makes sense on balance for us to do it. But it just seems more and more dubious. And there's another story out about Francis Collins, the director of National Institutes of Health, who recently testified that they have no control over the Wuhan lab despite funding it, and they all do this. We rely on people to live up to what they say they're going to do in their applications and so on and so forth, which is a little Pollyannish. But we see that Collins entered a memorandum of understanding with a Chinese communist operated Institute of Health there to facilitate cooperation in medical research, expresses hope to further push substantial collaboration between researchers and medical science in the two countries, and so on and so forth. And the following year, a 16-person delegation from NIH visited Beijing to meet with Chinese communist counterparts to solidify carrying out the funding of joint research programs. This goes back now more than a decade. And so, nothing happens overnight, particularly with the government. So all of this that's coming out now, of course, it's going to have deep roots because this happens over a period of time. But it's the same players because of the inertia of government and bureaucrats, the same players who've been on this program for a long time. And so all that momentum to go in one direction, now it's being called into question. And it seems to me they're sort of bailing water, and they're really relying on this idea, we're scientists. We don't involve ourselves in politics. They have complicated politics there. We have complicated politics here, but we're just focused in our narrow lane of science. And I just think that's a harder and harder position to hold for Fauci and Collins and others here.
No, that's right. And one of the things, the gall of this guy, Dack, he when people were starting to finally talk about the lab leak theory, he put out a tweet naming one of the head scientists down there at the Wuhan lab and saying, "Gosh, you're slandering her reputation, and how dare you?" And it's really not her that he's worried about. It's himself. But the bottom line here is, regardless of whether or not there's a civilian or scientific interest in doing this kind of research, it's indistinguishable from what you would do in a biological weapons program. And so the fact that we're doing this in a communist country, for national security reasons, seems like it should be just totally out of bounds.
I agree. It's like I said, it's a very difficult position for them to hold, I think, which is why they've never submitted it to public scrutiny. It's been pulled out through emails, and now this is all unraveling. But this is never anything that anybody would make in the form of a public argument, and I think that's telling as well. Arthur Bloom, editor of the American Conservative Online. Arthur, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Take care.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You're listening to Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
The Lou Dobbs Financial Report is brought to you by Signature Bank, helping local businesses succeed. Visit signaturebank.bank for your commercial banking needs.
I'm Lou Dobbs, United Airlines, to place multi-billion-dollar order for jetliners. New home index due out today. Supply chain shortages affecting summer menus. Those stories next.
I'm Lou Dobbs, and as you know, my friend Mike Lindell has